Imagine a city so deeply buried in its own financial grave that it cannot even afford to keep the law awake on the weekends. From 8 o'clock Friday night until the sun breached the smog on Monday morning, the streets belonged to whoever was strong enough or vicious enough to claim them. It was the perfect environment for a crime. But it was the absolute worst place on earth to brutalize the only son of a man who knew how to wage a quiet, invisible war. There is a specific kind of vengeance that doesn't require bullets or fists. It requires patience. It requires a network. And it requires the absolute, chilling willingness to systematically dismantle a person's life until they are breathing but no longer truly alive. The call came through on a Sunday afternoon, the shrill ring of the rotary phone slicing through the quiet hum of Declan's college dormitory. Declan had escaped the suffocating grip of the local steel town, trading the guaranteed grease and grime of the automotive plant for a pristine engineering scholarship. His childhood friend Callahan had not been so lucky. Callahan was a lifer, a good-natured guy who punched his card, did his hours, and spent his weekends trying to wash the metallic tang of the factory out of his mouth. The voice on the other end of the line was Callahan's grandmother, trembling so violently the receiver rattled against her jaw. Callahan had been jumped after his Friday shift. It wasn't a mugging, it was a slaughter. He had been beaten with such feral intensity that the paramedics who scraped him off the asphalt initially covered his face, assuming he was already gone. By some agonizing miracle, Callahan pulled through, but the damage was catastrophic. His spine was compromised, his vision irreparably blurred. At 22 years old, his life as an able-bodied man was over. He was bound for early disability, his future dissolved into a haze of painkillers and permanent twilight. When Declan rushed back to the soot-stained borders of his hometown, he found Callahan's father, Vaughn, sitting perfectly still in the sterile, fluorescent glare of the hospital waiting room. Vaughn was an artifact of a different era, a World War II and Korea veteran who claimed he spent his deployments safely tucked away in a tent, repairing radios. He never spoke of combat, he never raised his voice. He was the kind of man who commanded a room simply by occupying it. Vaughn didn't greet Declan with tears. He simply reached into the pocket of his worn canvas jacket and produced a scuffed, imitation leather wallet. It didn't belong to Callahan. The paramedics, in the chaotic blur of blood and flashing lights, had scooped it off the pavement next to Callahan's shattered body, assuming it was his. It wasn't. The driver's license inside bore the smug, heavy-lidded face of a local instigator named Rourke. Declan stared at the plastic card, a knot tightening in his gut. Everyone knew Rourke. He, along with his heavy-handed shadows, Bastion and Gideon, were the neighborhood predators. They were the sort of men who peeked in the dirt lots behind the high school, coasting through their factory jobs on intimidation and unearned arrogance. Declan looked at the veteran. The city was bankrupt. The police precinct was literally padlocked for the weekend, the dispatch lines rerouted to a recorded message citing municipal budget failures. Even now on a Tuesday, the overwhelmed, underpaid detectives offered nothing but apathetic shrugs. A dropped wallet was circumstantial. A bar fight gone wrong, they called it. Without witnesses willing to speak, the law was a dead end. "What are you going to do?" Declan asked, the words feeling utterly inadequate against the weight of the injustice. Vaughn slowly slipped the wallet back into his pocket. His eyes, cold and clear as winter ice, didn't blink. "I take care of my own." The veteran didn't march to Rourke's house with a baseball bat. He didn't scream in the streets. Instead, Vaughn went to the diner. He went to the VFW hall. He went to the quiet, smoke-filled back rooms of the local union chapters. Vaughn was a man who collected favors the way misers hoarded copper. He was universally respected, a cornerstone of a community built on backbreaking labor and unspoken loyalties. He gathered the gray-haired men of the city. The shift supervisors, the logistics coordinators, the men who controlled the lifeblood of the automotive plant where Rourke, Bastion, and Gideon drew their paychecks. Over lukewarm coffee and cheap cigars, Vaughn laid out the facts. He didn't ask for violence. He asked for an execution of a different kind. They needed absolute confirmation before turning the gears. For 3 weeks, Vaughn's quiet network observed. They became shadows in the dive bars where the 3 young men drank away their wages. The confirmation came on a damp Thursday night, spilling from Rourke's own mouth over a pitcher of cheap draft beer. He laughed loudly and vividly, mimicking the sound Callahan had made when Bastion's steel-toed boot connected with his ribs. The trap snapped shut the very next morning. The automotive plant was a closed-shop union environment. In that era, the union was God, and the men who ran it were his unforgiving angels. When Rourke, Bastian, and Gideon clocked in, the atmosphere had fundamentally altered. The air was thick, suffocating. It started with the schedule. Suddenly, the three men found themselves stripped of their comfortable mid-morning positions. They were reassigned to the slag-cleaning crew, the hottest, most dangerous, and physically agonizing sector of the foundry. They worked the graveyard shift, standing over vats of liquid fire, breathing in toxic fumes. Then came the emergency maintenance. Bastian would reach for his specialized pneumatic wrench, only to find the toolbox empty. When he complained to the foreman, he was met with a blank, unblinking stare and written up for losing company property. Gideon was ordered to calibrate heavy machinery, a task he was entirely untrained for. When he inevitably failed, stalling the assembly line, the entire floor of 200 men stopped working, turned, and stared at him in absolute, condemning silence. No one spoke to them. If Rourke sat at a table in the break room, the other 12 men would silently stand up, take their lunch pails, and walk away. A whispering campaign, vicious and entirely untraceable, bled through the factory. Every welder, every forklift driver, every secretary knew exactly what had happened to Callahan. Rourke and his crew were suddenly ghosts in a town that relied entirely on brotherhood. The psychological toll was devastating. They were paranoid, exhausted, and constantly making costly mistakes because the safety nets of their coworkers had been completely removed. If a heavy pallet was swinging too close to Rourke's head, no one shouted a warning. They simply watched. It took 14 months of sustained, relentless torment. The isolation fractured their bravado. Frustrated, furious, and on the verge of a breakdown from the hostile environment, all three men stormed into the supervisor's office on a Tuesday morning and quit, throwing their hard hats on the desk, convinced they could simply walk across town and find work at the competing steel mill. They had no idea they had just sealed their own tombs. Because they quit voluntarily, they were ineligible for severance. They were ineligible for unemployment benefits. They assumed they would bounce back, relying on their experience. But Vaughn's reach extended far beyond the walls of one factory. When Rourke applied at the steel mill, the hiring manager took one look at his name, casually tossed the application into the trash, and cited a sudden hiring freeze. When Bastian tried to get a job driving delivery trucks, an anonymous letter arrived at the dispatch office detailing his tendency to steal freight. A complete fabrication, but one backed up by a mysterious phone call from his former foreman. Gideon attempted to secure a position doing basic manual labor at the docks, but the dockworkers' union had already been briefed. They were rendered entirely unemployable within a 40-mile radius. Their meager savings evaporated. The bank foreclosed on Rourke's rusted muscle car. Gideon was evicted from his apartment. They tried to pool their resources and flee the city to start over in a place where their names meant nothing. But leaving required capital, and the quiet network made absolutely sure they couldn't scrape together a single dime. If they tried to sell their meager possessions, pawnshop owners, informed by the whispers, offered them pennies or refused service entirely. They were financially starved, trapped in the decaying carcass of the Rust Belt city that had birthed them. Years bled into decades. The city evolved, the factories closed, but the invisible prison built around the three men remained completely impenetrable. They deteriorated into destitute alcoholism, wandering the cracked sidewalks as hollow, shivering shells. Even the state's generous welfare programs remained mysteriously out of reach. Applications for aid were lost in the mail. Clerical errors plagued their files. A social worker would suddenly be reassigned just as their paperwork was about to clear. The bureaucracy of the city had been weaponized against them, orchestrated by old men sipping coffee in diners, honoring a debt to a quiet veteran. Vaughn eventually passed away, taking his military secrets to the grave. But the machine he built did not die with him. While cleaning out Vaughn's modest home, Callahan and Declan discovered a locked metal footlocker. Inside, alongside pristine service medals and classified operational documents that proved Vaughn was far more than a simple radio technician, was a ledger. It was a meticulously detailed contingency plan. Vaughn had not merely orchestrated a temporary revenge, he had engineered a generational curse. The ledger contained names, phone numbers, and instructions, passing the responsibility of the blockade to the younger generation of union men, city clerks, and local business owners. The mandate was clear. Until Rourke, Bastian, and Gideon were buried in the dirt, the invisible wall must never fall. They must never be allowed an ounce of comfort. They must wake up every single day and remember the boy they broke. To this day, in the freezing winters of that old industrial town, three ragged men huddle over trash can fires, entirely unaware of why the world completely and utterly rejected them. They believe they are incredibly unlucky. They believe the system failed them. They will never know that the system worked perfectly, exactly as a grieving father designed it to. True revenge is rarely loud. It doesn't scream, it doesn't boast, and it rarely leaves a bruise. The most terrifying vengeance is a quiet strangulation, a systemic dismantling of a person's future until all they have left is the crushing weight of their own existence. When we wrong others, we often anticipate an immediate reaction, a punch, a lawsuit, a shouting match. But we forget that some people possess the patience to simply rewrite the rules of our reality, trapping us in a cage we can't even see. Let this be a chilling reminder to walk through life with a measure of grace, because you never truly know who you are dealing with or how far their reach extends. If you found yourself captivated by this descent into absolute calculated retribution, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We explore the darkest, most compelling corners of human nature every single week, and you won't want to miss what we uncover next.